I can interrupt you if
Yeah,
I'm feeling neglected,
you
but
should. Welcome to the Greens and Blues 14er podcast. This episode, Zach pontificates and doesn't get paid for it. I try to be a lawyer and also don't get paid for it. And then we sit down and talk about recent closures of the DeCaLiBron and Mount Lindsey. So, Zach, today we're going to talk about the closures of the DeCaLiBron and Lindsey. But before we get into that, how are you doing?
I'm doing well today, Eric. How are you, man?
I'm good. I got back from a trip to the Dallas. How did you call it? The Dallas Metroplex?
The Metroplex.
I went to the Metroplex and I experienced the Metroplex and I didn't die. I didn't melt. I didn't drown in the humidity. I didn't suffer. I sound like a wimp. I came back fine. It was a fine trip. It was very warm, but otherwise I came back in good shape. So yeah.
For our listeners, Eric is only the Colorado is the warmest place Eric has ever lived.
Oh, by far. Yeah. But the
Chicago,
driest too.
Michigan, and Colorado,
Yeah.
yeah, but the driest. And
Yeah.
Texas in May can be a little balmy.
Yes, it was.
They actually think of it as kind of a cool season, but yeah, I'm just a few hours north in Norman, and it's been a glorious May.
Oh, there you go.
Everything is wet and lush right now, but we know the dark times are ahead, and by dark times I mean 100 degrees with overnight lows of 80 with
Oh
75%
gosh.
humidity. So
Oh my word. Yeah. But you've got a big trip coming up that unfortunately I was hoping to join you for, and I'm not able to. But talk to us about your trip that you've got coming up next week.
yeah, I am gonna go backpack into the Truchas Peaks in New Mexico. I did my gear check yesterday, and I had the startling revelation that my pack is really heavy.
It's like
Um,
45 pounds or something.
it did not feel good. Anyone that's solo backpacked knows you've basically got to bring everything you would if there were two or three of you, just
Yeah.
all by yourself, improvising ways to trim pack weight right now. And unfortunately, my tent takes up a lot of space and probably weighs a little too much. And I'm not sure how to fix that at the moment. But
Mm.
yeah, I'm going to go to the Truchas Peaks, try to hike in. Surely we'll hike in one day and then one big day where I hike the Truchas Peaks and hike out in one day, which is
Mm.
about 18 miles in one day, half of it with a pack, but most of it's downhill. So, um, I,
This should be
at,
fine then.
yeah, and at the end of it, what awaits is maybe a green chili cheeseburger somewhere,
Oh
or
gosh.
tamales, or something in New Mexico that's my home state that makes me happy. So how bad can it really be?
That's
Right?
that's going to be worth it 100 times.
100 times over. And then I'm gonna try and go get West Spanish Peak too.
Mm-hmm.
Take a day off after backpacking, and then go to West Spanish Peak. And I just read a conditions report on 14ers.com. It looks good to go. Snow's melted off. I'm pretty stoked.
Really? So
Yeah.
so what's the elevation of West Spanish? Is that
West Spanish Peak is 13,584.
Oh, it's 13. Oh my gosh, almost 13.6. So it has to be latitude.
Yeah.
Because 13.6 and it's mostly free of snow. That's encouraging.
Yeah. I just
That's really
saw
good.
a conditions report today.
Because most 14ers by now, I mean, I can see a few of them out of I take a short walk onto a trail near a house and I can see sometimes longs, I can see pikes and blue sky slash Bierstadt. There's snow all over the place still at the higher elevations. So
And that's part of, for those of you that try to plan late spring, early summer hikes, one of the things you have to really keep track of is snowpack.
for
And so
sure.
the snowpack this year in the Front Range, the northern Sawatch, the Gore, And the Elks was, I think, about 130% of average.
Heavy. Yeah, there's a lot of snow.
The San Juans were about 95% of average, and the Sangre de Cristos were about 85 to 90% of average. So about an
Okay.
average year.
Yep.
But there's also been a fair amount of warming that's gone on earlier than normal. So those have melted off a little quicker than they normally would.
Mm.
And West Spanish Peak is pretty far to the south.
Yep.
And then the
Yep.
Truchas Peaks in New Mexico are obviously quite far
Even
south. So I think that may be part of what you're observing is that, yeah, I've seen some trip reports from the Swatch. I mean, people are still skiing them.
there's oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Whereas I may go the Truchas Peaks and only find patchy snow in the trees.
Mm-hmm.
And West Spanish, I think there's just a couple patches of snow that you have to cross too. So
Okay.
pretty excited.
Sounds like a
We'll
fun trip.
we'll see how my body holds up. This is what we call a break-in hike,
There you
right?
go. That's a good one.
Well, Eric, what are we discussing today?
So, Zach, we're going to talk about the closure of Mount Lindsey and the closures and reopenings of the DeCaLiBron in recent years.
What is the DeCalibron, just for our uninitiated listeners?
Yeah, so the DeCaLiBron is just north of Fairplay near a very small town. They claim to be the highest town in the country, and depending on how you define population size, it may be, but the town of Alma. The DeCalibron is a group of four 14ers, Democrat, Cameron, Lincoln, and Bross. Probably should be called the DeCalibross, but for whatever reason, DeCalibron is what has stuck, and so it's that group of four 14ers in that area.
Excellent. Give us some background here as to why we might be observing some closures on those peaks and on Mount Lindsey. And these are related topics.
Yep. So in my mind, there's probably three important things for us to keep in mind when we consider these mountain closures. Number one, a person can actually own a mountain, which was very eye-opening to me when I first learned it. I think it was Culebra that I was looking at the greens and blues, and I saw Culebra was a class one. I said, "Oh, that's interesting." And I think I was talking with someone, and they said, "Oh, you have to pay to hike that mountain." And I said, "Why?" "Oh, because a family owns it." "Why? Like, how do you sign up for that? I want to apply for that job to own a mountain. Like that sounds fantastic." And the more we're gonna talk today, it maybe not as fantastic as it might seem, but that was a foreign concept to me getting into my 14er journey that
Mm-hmm.
a 14er could be privately owned. So, but that is the case on several 14ers in Colorado, and we're going to talk about a number of them here today. So that's the first thing to keep in mind, I think. The second thing is there was a piece of legislation enacted many years ago called the Colorado Recreational Use Statutes, the CRUS. And this statute was enacted to try to encourage private landowners to open up their resources to the public and allow them to enjoy their resources freely, for free. And I think that's an important part of it is
Mm-hmm.
if you're allowing it for free, you're in theory protected by this statute. And so if you own a lake or if you're part of a neighborhood that owns a lake and you want to freely allow people to boat or kayak, you in theory should be protected by this statute. If you own a mountain or whatever and you want people to be able to hike on it for free, you should be protected by this statute.
Protected, you mean
Protected from liability.
from liability if someone were to get
If
injured or
someone were
harmed.
to, exactly, someone were to use that resource for recreational use and get hurt in the process. The owner of that resource should be protected by this statute. It exists to encourage private landowners to allow their resources to be used for recreational use because here in Colorado, we have a lot of resources that are just beautiful and probably should be taken advantage of for
Mm-hmm.
recreational use in a safe and environmentally sound manner. So this statute exists. But then there's this third thing, and that is this lawsuit that was finally resolved. I
Mm-hmm.
think it was in court for over 10 years, finally resolved just within the past few years. So it set a legal precedent that kind of, if you want to say it this way, it kind of went against the CRUS. So this lawsuit involves a bicyclist that was on the grounds of the Air Force Academy back in 2008. And he was on a paved trail and he ran into a section that was washed out. Maybe it was a landslide or something happened to where there was some washout on the trail. And he comes upon this section. He gets hurt because of this section. He gets hurt pretty badly. He takes the Air Force Academy to court and says, "You're liable for my injury." After over 10 years, this case finally gets resolved and the court finds in favor of the bicyclist. And the reason is because it was found that there was an employee of the Air Force Academy that knew that this washout happened. I think they learned about it just a few weeks before this accident happened.
It was a prohibited trail, was it not?
It was a prohibited trail, yeah.
But they didn't have, they did have signs that said prohibited trail, but they didn't have enough signage, and nor did they try to attempt to block access, correct?
Exactly, exactly. They didn't have apparently enough signage, and there was no signage revolving around this washout that had happened.
Even though it's a
This
prohibited trail
section,
and they
even though it's
shouldn't
a
have to.
prohibited trail. Yeah, so there's no signage around, having a detour or anything like that. Not enough signage around this trail being prohibited in the first place. So this bicyclist wins this court case and not only wins over $7 million in damages. So private landowners in Colorado, their ears perk up when this happens and they say, "Oh, darn, that's a big amount of money that this statute may not protect me for on my private land if I let people hike on my land." And so, in the case of the DeCaLiBron and Lindsey, the landowners just decided, you know what, until we can figure out a better solution, until we can resolve this and prevent us from taking on that liability, we're just going to close these mountains. We're done. And that's what happened.
It seems to me there's a few things of interest here. First is there is a it's hard to blame a private landowner. So let's say you're the landowner that owns Mount Lindsey's interesting. It's got slices of private land ownership on it, and it's got
Exactly.
a slice of actually national forest ownership. If you own a share of interest in that peak, one that is difficult to hike,
Mm-hmm.
and one where this is for another episode where you could easily get injured on such a mountain,
Oh, for sure.
you can understand the desire to protect yourself from any potential liability, because the bar that Air Force Academy suit sets is a rather interesting one. It's not like it was a trail that by all appearances looked like a trail that anyone should use. It was a trail that they had told people to not go on. And they had like a sign, but it wasn't, I guess, conspicuous enough, nor did they warn everybody of all the dangers on the trail, which is somewhat akin to something like a 14er. So if I'm a private landowner, I can see why you would want to protect yourself from potential liability on people hiking a 14er and hurting themselves, which happens somewhat frequently.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a second issue here, and I don't know if this is like my hot take moment here, but I will never understand the attitude of willfully adopting a risky undertaking, hobby, sport, whatever we want to call it, avocation, like mountain bike riding or hiking or whatever, knowing full well that that activity comes with inherent risks, then incurring one of those risks, like getting hurt, and then suing somebody else for it. Like, I don't know what this guy's real situation is. He may have some medical bills that have to be paid. I get it. But it would be like me and going up to, I don't know, Mount Elbert, which is in the Forest Service, and hiking Mount Elbert, taking a spill off Mount Elbert, breaking my leg, and then suing the US federal government. I
Right.
mean, to most people, that sounds preposterous.
Yeah.
I know what I'm getting myself into. And I think there's some argument to be made. There is a legal case for what is called tacit risk. So, like, if you and I go play a men's league hockey game, Eric, since you're from Michigan, I'm assuming you do that frequently. I don't know. If it's a league that allows fighting, for example, and I get into a fight, I cannot sue the other guy for assault. In the NHL, nobody ever gets sued for assault when they get into a fight
Yep.
because there is the assumption of what is called tacit risk, right? You know what you're getting yourself into when you sign on for it. I would argue that there's something similar going on with hiking or with mountain bike riding. There's the assumption of risk when you do it. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, and to add to it, in everything that you just mentioned, you're using your own free will to make that decision and participate in that activity. And as you mentioned, Zach, you're taking on that tacit risk of, hey, I might get hurt. I might break a leg. I might have something worse happen to me, whatever it is. But you're using your own free will to say, I'm going to make this decision. I'm going to participate in this activity that has risk in it. And I have to live with whatever consequences of that decision might be. I might make the summit and have a glorious day and have a great sandwich at top, or I might break my hand falling or whatever it is. Whatever the results are of that decision that I made, I have to live with those. And so, yeah, I agree with you completely. I think it's a little bit insane to have the ability to make that decision, to go through with that decision, and then try to blame someone else for the inherent risk that was involved with that decision.
Yeah, because I practice philosophy in my day job, I just think the reduction to the absurd of this would be like on the knife edge at Capitol,
Mm,
they put like chains across it and they're like, danger beware. If you cross this, you might die, right? And then if you hop over the chain, then you've like, well, or maybe they've got a waiver that you sign when you walk up there. But and it's interesting that it only seems to attach to private ownership, right?
hmm.
Nobody's going
Yeah,
to sue the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management or the Park Service. Some guy takes a tumble off El Capitan in Yosemite. Nobody's suing the Park Service,
right, right.
but it is a feature of private ownership that for some reason they are suable, whereas other entities like the federal government or state governments are not. So how does this lead to the closure of DeCalibros? I think we should start. I think we,
We're gonna mess it up and just
screw
try
it
to
up.
confuse our
Yeah.
listeners.
So how does this lead to the closure of DeCalibron?
So the DeCalibron it's an interesting entity because it is four separate entities, and there's a couple of different things to keep in mind around the DeCalibron. First, Cameron is on public land. It's Forest Service land. It's, as far as I'm aware, it's always been on Forest Service land. So that's really not part of this whole discussion. The problem with Cameron is you really can't get to it unless you go through Democrat or Lincoln first, unless you're a white GMC truck last year with Arkansas plates, and then maybe you can try, but your car will have to get towed off of there. The other thing to keep in mind is Bross has always been officially closed. At least the summit has been. And there's this bypass trail that I think skirts kind of west on the west side of the mountain
Mm-hmm.
and just shy of the elevation of the summit where hikers are encouraged to go around.
There's a bunch of open
There are shafts that are around, yeah.
mine shafts and prospects on Bros that this is not just tacit risk, right? Like if you fall down one of those, you will die kind of
Mm-hmm.
things. And those are not, I guess, normal risk that's associated with hiking. So they've had that closed for quite some time.
It's been closed for a long time. And that leads to kind of where the overall closure discussion goes is because Democrat, Lincoln, and Bross had all been kind of majority owned, if you will, by one gentleman. His name is John Rybar. He owns mining claims, and he has owned mining claims. I'll clarify that in a second. but he owns mining claims on Lincoln and Bros, like you mentioned. And there's a few other smaller players involved with him, but he's the majority owner of those claims. And so basically, when this lawsuit came down and the Air Force Academy and this bicyclist, when that all got resolved in court, John Ryber basically said, no, we're closing the DeCaLiBron, and Cameron isn't affected, but the rest of them, I own, majority stakes in some of these mining claims, and I'm just going to close these mountains. I'm not willing to take on that risk and that liability if this new precedent is being set by this lawsuit. So there were a couple things that have happened since the latest closure. I think the latest closure of the DeCaLiBron was kind of Q1, Q2 of 2023. So two things have happened since then. Number one, John Ryber sold his mining claims for Democrat. So Lincoln and Ross have been in his family for a long, long time. They were mining silver out of there. He still has interest in those mining claims, but Democrat has had molybdenum, and I think his interest in that has waned. And so he basically just said,
Probably because the spot price of molybdenum has gone way down. So
yeah, so it's just not as valuable. So he basically decided, I'm going to sell these mining claims on Democrat. And so he did. The conservation fund basically went in, bought that land, and then basically transferred it right over to the Forest Service. So now, as things stand, the Forest Service basically owns and maintains Democrat and Cameron. So he completed that. And I guess when I hear interviews with him, when I read articles about him, yes, he owns mining claims on these mountains. It seems to me like he has some level of goodwill, I would say. I think he genuinely wants people to enjoy
Mhm.
the land that he owns. I think he genuinely has a goodwill towards wanting to not just close mountains down and prevent people from enjoying his resources. I think he genuinely wants people to be able to hike on those mountains and enjoy that land. So I think selling Democrat was part of that. The other thing that happened was, and John Ryber was instrumental in making this happen, installed a waiver system at the DeCaLiBron.
Mhm.
I don't know of any other waiver system that exists around 14ers, at least yet. It's probably coming, but he basically installed this kiosk at the Kite Lake Trailhead where people can go sign this waiver, in theory, free him from any liability of anyone that wants to hike the mountains, and thus kind of opening it back up to folks that want to hike the DeCaLiBron. Now, he's mentioned before that this waiver system is kind of a stopgap. It's not really a permanent solution. He wants reform around the CRUS. There has been some recent reform to that statute,
Or at
but
least there's been legislative attempts at reforming the statute, right? Haven't they failed?
most of them have failed. I believe earlier this year, actually, Governor Polis did sign a bill that got through the state legislature. So it remains to be seen whether John Ryber and others feel like it's enough.
Clearly they don't because Lindsey still remains closed,
Lindsey is
right?
still closed, and this waiver system still exists on the DeCaLiBron. So, and this waiver system, I have not been to the DeCaLiBron in the last couple of years. It's reported to be spotty cell access at
Mhm.
best. You have to use your phone. You have to get in through a QR code and sign this waiver. And apparently there are a couple of signs up the road a little bit that also have this QR code where you can sign this waiver. But even there, I think the cell service is pretty spotty from what I'm understanding. So the best thing to do is just go on 14ers.com ahead of time, access the QR code through that, and then go whichever day you're going to go. And so again, it seems like there have been some measures that have been taken to permanently reopen the DeCaLiBron. Whether it really is going to be permanent remains to be seen. I would say that the current status of it as of May of 2024, it's open. I would call it temporary because the owner basically has the right at any time to say, no, I don't feel comfortable. I'm closing it again. And I believe in recent years he has done that more than once.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's the status around the Calibron. It's open, but hopefully it remains open. But that remains to be seen. So Zach, do you want to walk us through the closure of Mount Lindsey?
Mount Lindsey's a lot more simple. Um, it was closed in September of 2021. I mean, a lot of what's going on here that we've seen is that private landowners are interpreting this Air Force Academy ruling in their own way, or they're
Mhm.
being advised by lawyers to do so. And so the land trust that holds the summit and ridge line of Mount Lindsey is interpreting it in perhaps a safe or strict way, safe for them, strict for hikers.
Mhm.
So if anyone knows the standard route on Lindsey, you're going to access it from a northeast ridge. And essentially, that northeast ridge line is once you get to that northeast ridge line is the property boundary.
Mhm. Yep.
Anyone that's ever hiked it, once you top out on that ridge, you know it. That's the property boundary for Mount Lindsey.
If you turn right on the ridge, you'll go to Lindsey. If you turn left at that saddle, you're gonna hit Iron Nipple, right? That's the
Iron
ridge you're
Nipple
talking
and
about.
then Huerfano and
Mhm.
Huerfanito
Yep.
further down.
Yep.
And so those summits are actually straddling property boundaries. So like Iron Nipple, like if you stand on the summit of Iron Nipple, you're technically in Forest Service land and private property. It's kind of like
Mm.
going to the Four Corners.
Yeah.
Um, Lindsey is different because the primary access on Lindsey is through private property.
Mhm.
And the landholder there has interpreted this ruling and I guess the loopholes or gaps in the CRUS statute in a way that they do not want anyone accessing that mountain. Or rather, can put it this way, they've put up signage which is prominent and perhaps unavoidable that tells people to not go on, and that if they do so, the private landowners cleanse themselves of liability,
Mm.
right? If anyone goes on that mountain now, it's on them, which I would argue it probably always is anyway. But
Mhm. Yeah.
that's the status of Lindsey, and as of May 2024, it still remains closed.
Yep.
There are, if you go to the 14ers.com, there are multiple threads on this issue for Lindsey and for DeCaLiBron. If you go to one of the threads, some people have written the land ownership group because Lindsey's actually accessible from the south as well. Just no one ever does it because it goes through all private property. Some people have done it that way as part of finishing their 14er list, but the standard and easiest routes are at this time all closed on Lindsey. And this has created a hangup. Some people doing 14er records for run throughs
Mhm.
can't touch Lindsey at this moment, or if they do so, they are and they publicize it on Strava or 14ers.com. They're publicizing their
Like
trespassing.
trespassing. Yep.
So there's a lot of issues involved there. There's people that want to finish their list, and that's one glaring omission. It's a spectacular peak. It's a great mountain. It's not some throwaway like Cameron is.
Just throwing shade at Cameron.
I remember
It
when I
happens a
summited
lot,
Cameron, I
actually.
was like, did I just summit? Like I'm on my way to Lincoln. Like,
You're just
did
kind
that?
of walking still.
Yeah,
You're not
like
really
I
ascending
slowed
anything.
down a little bit as I. It's like in Oklahoma, there's these mountains called the Arbuckle Mountains, and I'm doing air quotes with my fingers because Interstate 35 goes over the Arbuckle Mountains, and I've always said that if you don't have to break your cruise control to go over something, it can't be a mountain, right? So yeah, that's the status of Lindsey. And as you said earlier, I mean, we can kind of say two things here. As a public service announcement, for those of you that are planning your summer hiking, if you just want to go do Democrat and Cameron, knock yourself out. If you want to go do Democrat, Cameron, Lincoln, and Bross and sign a waiver, go right ahead. But if you want to do Lindsey, don't.
Don't do it.
And I say that for two reasons. One is to not further infuriate private landowners. They do own these peaks and they could really restrict access like they do at Culebra, where they literally have fences around it and they have people monitoring it. I don't think the owners of Lindsey wish to do that. I think that's a cost that they do not run a private hunting ranch like the owners of Culebra do.
Right.
They don't have the kind of financial leverage. I think they just kind of happen to own Lindsey. There's nothing intrinsically worth having there at least that's economically viable. There's not a mine to be had up there. Sangres are not all that mineral rich, not like the 10 Mile and Mosquito Peaks are, which have a lot of great ore veins. It's dusty, it's steep, there's nothing to hunt up there. So there's really not a lot that's economically viable there. So they're not going to patrol it. But public service announcement, don't bother them with this. Go hike something else. Go hike Huerfano or Iron Nipple or California Peak, which is in the same valley. There's 637 13ers and 14ers in Colorado. Go do one of those.
You can find one.
You can find one. I guess the where I want to steer this to because of my own predilections is I read through way too many comments on 14ers.com and I've listened to there's another podcast, the Non-Standard 14ers podcast, that had a guest on. And an issue that I think underlies a lot of this is perhaps the ethical / political question of it is weird in some sense that we allow people to own a mountain,
Mm,
right? Like you mentioned that earlier,
I got an
Eric.
amen for that.
Yeah, I'm so conflicted about this because when you think about it, we allow people to own valleys, allow people to own tableland farms, right? I own a house. Like one piece of earth isn't intrinsically any different than another piece of earth.
Mm,
So on that account, it's like, yeah, I can understand it. And when you look at the histories of these peaks, so Democrat Cameron Lincoln Ross, those are historical mining claims. I don't want to get into the process of filing a mining claim and how easy it was back in the day and how that allowed you access and often property rights. The peaks in the Sangre de Cristos, like Culebra and Lindsey, are historic land grants,
mm.
or at least subdivisions of old historic land grants that the Spanish handed out when they didn't even control this land, right? They looked at it and they said it was theirs. There's a lot of kind of European colonial hubris involved in those, but those have been handed down for generations and generations and then sold for generations and generations. And so those are old remnants of the old land grant system. But on the other hand, there's something really, I would say, American about this kind of resistance to owning a feature of land that we use for wilderness purposes. It feels weird in a way, like if you go to Europe, if you go to Switzerland, mountains are owned. Unless it's a national park, people own it.
That's
And
interesting. Wasn't aware that that was the case in Europe.
yeah, and the government has to purchase right of way through that property so that people can walk up it or hike it.
Interesting. Okay.
But in America, we have this long standing system and tradition of public land since the founding of the Forest Service in the 1870s. It roughly coincides with the depopulation of the American West of American Indians and also with the evolution. I mean, all these things come together all at once, and it's not a coincidence. The evolution of the concept of wilderness, the value of wilderness,
Mm,
the the kind of unfolding or the unraveling or the apex of manifest destiny. We've got a bunch of public land, and most of those 637 peaks I mentioned a minute ago are on public land,
mm-hmm.
and they're held for by the Forest Service, which holds them for timber and other uses. And we've gotten very used to that idea, such that when I hear that a peak is owned, there's a part of me that's like, no.
Kind of bristle a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, what are your thoughts, Eric? This is getting very abstract, but should somebody be allowed to own a mountain?
Yeah, it's such an awkward thing. Like I was thinking, you mentioned I'm from Michigan originally, so one of the parallels that came to mind was, so we're surrounded by the Great Lakes.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lake. It's kind of the sixth Great Lake, if you will. It's called Lake St. Clair, just east of Detroit. We'd go visit there all the time and swim and boat and all that. Mostly maintained by the U.S. A little bit of it's within the boundary of Ontario, Canada, but it would be as if someone owned that lake. And it's not a great lake, but it is still a giant, massive lake. It's as if someone would own that lake, and
Mm-hmm.
that's such a foreign concept because no one owns that lake. It's government run and government owned, but it's the same kind of thing. And so I think that's why it was so foreign when I learned, oh, Culebra is owned by a family. Like, really? You can do that? Like, there's just something very foreign about that in my mind. It's very odd that something that is so, like you said, very prominent, very desirable for people to recreate on. It's a very desirable place for people to enjoy the views and enjoy Colorado's resources, but somebody owns it. It's just, there's something that's very, very strange and jarring about that. And so, yeah, I agree. It feels very weird to say that a mountain can be owned, but that is the reality in some cases.
Yeah, I'm not going to say it's wrong. Now, I mean, we could get into the weeds on whether or not private property is correct or not, but I will say, yeah, I think weird is probably the most precise I'm going to get here. Like it feels strange.
It does.
And I remember hiking the peaks to the north of Culebra. So these are there's Trinchera Peak and there's Leaning Left Hand Peak and Leaning South, Mount Maxwell. And I remember running into the fence for the ranch there.
Yeah, I think it's Cielo Vista.
And I remember getting to that fence and thinking, there was a part of me is like, I wanted to be a scofflaw. I want to be like, you know, Zach De La Rocha.
Breaking the law,
Yeah,
breaking the
yeah, yeah.
law.
I won't do what you tell me. Um, Nobody owns this land. And I guess perhaps the reason that we differentiate a mountain from a valley is that to us, mountains are sacred,
Mm,
and the sacred should never be owned.
mm. I like
Sacred
that.
means it's separate, it's set apart, and it's set apart from our normal systems of property ownership. I think that for a lot of us, we look at mountains as different places. They are not a part of the general economy where we buy and sell things, where we trade things. They stand outside of those systems of exchange. They stand outside of those kind of systems of economy and even politics. Like they're their own place. And I think it's because I feel like mountains are perhaps sacred and holy and different that I'm willing to exempt them in my head, mentally, morally, ethically, from property ownership. So yeah, when I hear about like Lindsey closing, I'm like, you should have known that in the first place, man. But
Mm,
but I get it that someone does. Now, if that were me, if I was like a billionaire, I would buy up Culebra. I would buy up the ranch that holds Culebra. I would buy up Lindsey. I'd buy up mining claims on DeCalibros, and then I would
mhm.
just gift them to the government in exchange for a flight in an F-35 or something like that, right? Um, and I know that some landowners in Colorado do own parts of mountains and they put them into conservation easements, which allow for recreational use. And
Mm,
essentially, it's kind of this halfway state. They get tax breaks. They can't really do what they want with it anymore, like you can with private property. And I know that Colorado 14ers Initiative is working hard, along with Nature Conservancy and other agencies, to buy this land and then deed it back to the government.
yep.
I would hope that something like that gets worked out because I think that fits more with the ethos of, I'm going to sound like Aldo Leopold here, like what it means to be American is to have like these spaces that you go to and that you get away from your normal life and you go run around in and you go feel free. And I teach an environmental ethics class, and one of the things that Leopold talks about is that part of the greatness of wilderness, and this goes back to our conversation about the Air Force Academy thing, is that you can go get hurt in it and it's contact with something real.
Hmm. Yeah,
Most of our lives are kind of sanitized from risk, and maybe that's the good thing about these places.
I love it. My last question is, how does it feel during summer break to be thinking about so many of the things that I'm sure you're thinking about when you're teaching philosophy and religion classes during the school year? You didn't really get a break, did you?
Oh, this is for anyone that's ever taught before. There's a joke. I teach for free. I get paid to grade. No, I love talking about this stuff. Just don't make me grade anything. I don't want to find the thesis. But yeah, I think that you don't have to have done philosophy or anything to feel this way. Like
No, for sure.
I read through tons and tons of threads, and there's people fall on two sides of this, or they polarize themselves into two sides, or maybe that's where the nuance gets lost in all these. But there are some people that are just like, hey, it's private property, you do what you want. And that's in this system, that is true.
From a legal standpoint, yeah.
From a legal standpoint, that is true.
Yeah.
Then there are other people that are kind of like, no, it's wrong. And perhaps from a traditional kind of American way of looking at public land at wilderness, that's true too.
Mm.
Both those things can be true
Mm-hmm.
simultaneously. And I think that what gets lost in here is a bigger conversation about, yeah, those things may be true, but are they right?
Mm-hmm.
And what is desirable? I don't know if having anyone own Lindsey is desirable. The reason for having private property is so you can do things with it. Well, no one's going to do anything with Lindsey.
Well, we
Um,
can't do anything with Lindsey now, so that makes it even more undesirable for those of us that don't own Lindsey because we don't have access to it like we would like to have. So,
yeah, that's the thing about property. Property is exclusivity. It means you can keep people out.
mm-hmm.
Right now, ironically, Lindsey is real wilderness. It's because nobody's going, or nobody
Yeah, yeah,
should be going there.
yeah, true.
Um, so yeah, all very fascinating. And I think this brings up a lot of really profound issues about how we view land and what makes it what it is. I, on principle, will probably never hike Calibra because I don't think I should have to pay someone $150 to hike a mountain.
And that's
That,
pretty rich for my blood too. So,
yeah, I mean,
if it was 20 bucks, I might consider it, but
part of me is just super cheap, right? Like $150. Like, I better be like, that better be my last peak, right?
oh yeah, that's like I want to ensure that the weather isn't going to come in and make me
Yeah.
fail that summit.
And from all accounts that I hear, Cielo Vista does a really good job. Like they give you they escort you
Hmm.
to the trailhead,
Yep.
and
Yeah, you get lunch and
you get they're really nice. Like no
I've heard
shade
that
at
too.
them. I get
Yep.
it. They're doing what they do. Don't hate the player, hate the game. As long as we allow people to own mountains, I think they manage that mountain quite well.
Hmm.
They're not strip mining it like, Molycorp did with Bartlett Mountain, which destroyed a mountain. That is much lower hanging fruit, in my opinion, that you literally had a well, I don't think it's a 13er
I was gonna say
anymore.
I thought it was a 13er, but I think
Was
it's
it's gone now.
yep.
Inaccessible and gone. And that to me is a much bigger issue than Calibra is.
Yeah,
That is
that's a great call.
that's mountain aside, right?
Well,
That's
it's the destruction of the resource that we
mm,
are trying to enjoy. So yeah, it's a great point.
yeah. So, wow, lots to talk about.
Yeah. There's so much nuance in it that's I think where the discussion generally lands is like you mentioned some people will polarize themselves, but there's so much nuance and there's so much gray area in between that's I think that's where we end up with well, one mountain is still closed and another set of mountains is open, but it's kind of hanging by a thread in my opinion.
Another angle here is that there's a history here of mixed use on these peaks. For a long time, these peaks were only seen as good because you could have extractive activities on
Mhm.
them. You can
Yep.
mine them or whatever. And a lot of us enjoy the fruits of that. A lot of these hiking trails, points of access, trailheads, it's because miners built them.
Mm.
But then at some point, our appreciation of these peaks moved to a different kind of extraction. Now we're extracting memories and challenges from them in a different way. And I think all that is part of that complicated nuance, right? Like, what are we
Mm.
getting out of these places? What have we gotten out of these places? I would end this with a plea that they clarify some of these issues so that these landowners aren't in limbo anymore.
Mm. Great call.
And so that people can hike these darn things.
Mhm.
We need some way of definitively them waiving or releasing themselves from liability to what happens on these places. And if I have to sign a waiver when I go there, I'm fine with that.
Yep.
That's easy enough for me. If that releases them from liability, that's cool. If there's just a sign that says, once you pass this point, you have tacitly agreed to whatever
Assume
happens to
all
you.
risk. Yep.
You have assumed all risk. cool. If
Yep.
there needs to be one of those at every trailhead, fine. But I think we just need to get this resolved so that some people can go hike Lindsey some more, or Lincoln and Bross, and then do that dreadful descent down Bross.
100% agree with everything you just said, including that forsaken scree slope.
I would never,
Awful.
yeah, we'll do another episode on that. I would never do that ever again. I don't know why I didn't go back. That was, yeah, that was dumb. We need to devote an entire episode to people doing really crazy to avoid going back over the safe way that they came. That is, that
There's
is,
probably a lot of good examples of weird stuff that probably take a whole lot more effort, but just avoid wackiness.
yeah, like I know that the way I just came works, but I'm going to try something really nuts to maybe cut an hour out of my day. Like, what?
Uh,
But when you're hiking, it makes sense.
yeah, when
Like
you're up there, it's like, oh, I think this can go. I'm gonna do
this will
this.
go. I can do this. I mean, it looked like a cliff from below, but totally
Right.
looks good up here.
There's something about this that just makes sense. I'm just
And I
gonna
can
do
get
it.
back down to my car like an hour quicker.
Right.
I gotta do it. Well,
Uh,
Eric, where can other people interact with us and send their philosophical comments regarding peak closures, whether or not you can own a mountain, and all those various issues?
yeah, we would love to hear from our listeners. So they can reach out to us at our Gmail address, greensandbluespodcast@gmail.com. They can reach out at our Facebook group. They can send you a tweet. Is it still a tweet if it's called X now formally?
That's where Elon Musk just totally met. He took
Oh,
something with an identifiable brand and a verb that went with it, and he just turned it into X. I don't. They can't
yeah.
X at me.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't X you. I
I
can't
think you still
X.
say tweet.
I think
Um,
so.
but you
I'm
can't
gonna.
DM me unless I follow you and you follow me. So it's really
Oh,
strange
that's
now.
so odd. Yeah. So don't X Zach. Tweet Zach on X at NM Hiker Person. We've got a few YouTube videos up if you want to check those out too. But yeah, we would love to hear everyone's comments on everything we discussed here, which, wow, we covered quite a swath today, Zach, huh?
We did. I didn't go full on Karl Marx. So kudos to me. Or Chief
Maybe another
Seattle.
time.
How can you own a mountain? I thought about going that way. Yeah, a lot of ground covered here and a lot of stuff to think about. And by the time listeners hear this, I will have done my hike in New Mexico and moved my suffering on to some other place. So
And hopefully we'll get a full report on your backpacking trip.
I think that should be our next episode, Eric. I
I,
think
I'm
a
in.
a blow by blow. Well, it's still fresh on my mind. Like this, I haven't backpacked in a while. It's been a little bit, so I've been schlepping around my neighborhood with my pack on. I'm just a little worried about. I remember as a kid, my shoulders just hurting
Oh gosh,
all
yeah.
the time.
That's yeah, for sure. Well, so when you're training, are your bags of kitty litter in the pack with you along with like some 20-pound weights, or how are you
It's
getting weight in your pack to
it's
keep
like
going?
30 pounds of kitty litter
Wow.
put into Ziploc bags covered in duct tape, and then I just
Thank
put them
you,
in the different.
Costco.
Yeah, I put them in the different compartments.
Wow.
Yeah,
That's
so
impressive.
I can do 3 miles pretty easy in my neighborhood, but I live at 1,100 feet in Oklahoma. Like it's kind of
Mm,
flat here,
That's a
so
little different
a little
than
different
Pruchas.
than an 8.5 mile mountain hike. So we'll see. We'll see what
Yeah.
happens.
Yeah. We'll look forward to hearing the full report from New Mexico and Southern Colorado.
Thanks so much, and we'll catch you again soon.